to see so many of you joining us today for our webinar, An Introduction to Domestic Abuse and the Role of Schools. Before I hand you over to my colleagues who will be delivering today's session, I thought it would be useful to do some introductions and to explain a bit about the Domestic Abuse Priority Action Group who are delivering the training for you today. So my name is Liz Turner. I'm the Housing Management Team Leader at West Leicestershire District Council. I'm also the Chair of the Domestic Abuse Priority Action Group on behalf of the Safer West Leicestershire Partnership. We've also got Gillian with us today. Gillian, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Gillian Hallock and I'm the lead for safeguarding at West Leicestershire District Council, and I'm also a member of the Domestic Abuse Priority Action Group.
We've also got Katie and Benita here with us today who will be delivering the session from the Children and Family Wellbeing Service, and they will introduce themselves properly when I hand over to them to start the session off. Today's session is brought to you by members of the Safer West Leicestershire Partnership, and the partnership is made up of agencies from across West Leicestershire, including the district councils, the county councils, housing teams, the police, fire, social care, the Children and Family Wellbeing Service, health and probation, just to name a few. So every year the partnership sets its priorities for the year ahead, and each priority has an action group established who are responsible for pulling that together and developing an action plan for that priority. And quite rightly, domestic previously and continues to be this year a priority for our partnership. And myself and my colleagues here today are part of the Domestic Abuse Action Group. So when delivering this year's plan, in light of COVID and the concerns that we raised around the impact on young people who have potentially been out of school quite a lot this year and could potentially be returning into school having experienced domestic abuse, we felt it was really important that we had a real focus in the action plan around young people. So as part of delivering our actions to support the national 16 days of action for domestic abuse, which is ongoing currently, we decided to pull together these bite-sized webinars aimed at raising awareness and understanding of domestic abuse for those working in schools, and recognising the impact that it has on the young people that you work with every day. So I'm now going to hand you over to Katie and Benita from the Children and Family Wellbeing Service, who have very kindly prepared the session for you today. So over to you, ladies.
Thanks, Liz. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Herbert. I'm the Team and Partnership Manager for the Children and Family Wellbeing Service. I manage the family team in West Leicestershire, and I'm with one of my team leaders, Ben.
Hi everybody, my name is Benita Handley. I'm one of 3 team leaders in West Leicestershire for the Children and Family Wellbeing Service.
So before we kick off, I suppose our kind of credentials in terms of delivering this session, I have the manager lead within my peer group for domestic abuse for the county, which involves attendance of the domestic abuse strategy group. And I have led a piece of work around implementation of a county-wide training programme around domestic abuse, and support the Domestic Abuse Champions Forum, which we have within Leicestershire County Council. Ben, I don't know if you want to mention about your role.
Yep. So part of my role as team leader, I have oversight of the cases for my workers, and in those cases, domestic abuse is a factor. We see it a lot. Also as well, I'm trained in delivering the Freedom Programme, which I've done on many occasions, so I'm quite knowledgeable about the subject.
Yep, thank you. Next slide, please, Gillian. So just a little bit of kind of webinar etiquette to sort of get us going. We're all kind of, or we've all had to get to grips with virtual platforms. But it's really helpful, and I think we can get more out of the session if people can put their webcams on, if that's possible. Mute your mic when not speaking, but we are this session is very interactive, so we do need you to respond to us either verbally or in the message bar, so please do that, because otherwise the session will be over very, very quickly and you won't have got an awful lot from it. There are times throughout the session for you to ask questions, but you can either shout out or use the hands up icon if you want to ask a question. But hopefully you'll get a lot from sort of the next 50 odd minutes of delivery that we will be providing for you. Next slide, please. Before we kind of get going into the content, just a little health warning, really. We are going to be talking about domestic abuse. That is a very sensitive and emotive topic. And we are aware that even though this is a relatively light touch whistle-stop tour of what to look for, some of the data around domestic abuse and your role within schools, things can be triggering for people, and we're aware of that. So it's vital that you as delegates keep yourself safe through the session. If anything makes you feel uncomfortable, you can leave without explanation, or remain in the call, and we will provide our contact details at the end if there's anything that you particularly want to raise. We'll also remain on the call, so if there are any pressing concerns that you have for yourselves or for children that you're working with, we can kind of put those to bed, so to speak, before you kind of end for the day. But we just wanted to sort of put that out there, really, because this is, you know, it's not ideal that we're delivering topics like domestic abuse in a virtual way. So it's important that we safeguard each other as part of that process.
Can I just mention as well that we acknowledge that perpetrators can be both men and women, but throughout the session we'll probably be referring to the perpetrator as a male, just so that you all know.
Because that is the most common scenario. So Ben, over to you.
Yep, okay, so this is where we need you guys to be interactive with this. So the first question that I would like some suggestions for is, what is domestic abuse? What do you think domestic abuse is? So you can either shout out, or you could write them in the message box if you wanted to, or if you just want to write them out and keep them to yourself. Write them down, I mean, sorry.
So what is domestic abuse? Any thoughts? Hurting another adult in the household. Thank you, Becca.
I'm feeling really brave. I'm going to unmute.
Well done.
So it could be physical or emotional or sexual, psychological.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of those, more than just physical.
Yeah, thank you. In the chat, we've got physical violence, harassment, sexual violence, any form of intentional harm. I've got someone typing, so we'll just wait and see what that is. Does anyone else want to unmute and say what their understanding of domestic abuse is? Okay, perhaps move on.
Yep, we'll move on. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please, Gillian? I'll just read this one out. An instant or pattern of instance of controlling, threatening, or violence. Okay, brilliant. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so we just got a definition for you of domestic abuse. So any incident or pattern of instance of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimidated, or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. So just to make you aware as well that the age changed actually in 2012 from 18 to 16, and the new domestic abuse bill from 2020 this year recognises that children are victims in their own right. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to move on to the domestic abuse quiz. So again, lots of answers in the message bar if you can do. Okay, so next slide, please, Gillian. Why does domestic abuse happen? A, drugs and alcohol, B, mental health, C, poverty, or D, none of the above?
None of the above.
Okay.
We've got all of the above in the message bar.
The reason I'm saying none of the above is because all of the above are factors of that could make the situation worse in terms of domestic abuse, but they're not actually leading factors of domestic abuse, if that makes sense.
What was that? Sorry, I missed that last one. What was the last comment?
All of the above and other reasons.
Anybody else? Okay, so domestic abuse happens because of power and control. So if I gave you a little example of that, so if you were working with a female victim and she says, well, my husband is abusive towards me because he has mental health problems, then my question would be, okay, is he abusive towards his mum, his dad, his aunt, his uncle? And the chances are they'll say no, and that's because it's about power and control and not about mental health. If I read this little statement for you, so domestic violence stems from a desire to gain and maintain power and control over an intimate partner. Abusive people believe they have the right to control and restrict their partner's lives, often either because of they believe their own feelings and needs should be the priority in the relationship, or because they enjoy exerting the power that such abuse gives them. Okay.
Thank you. Next slide, please, Gillian. So we're going to get into a bit of the data now around domestic abuse, some of which is national, some of it is more localised. So what proportion of children live in or have lived in a home where domestic abuse is prevalent? A, 1 in 3, B, 1 in 5, or C, 1 in 7? Use the message bar to tell us what you think. So a couple of people saying B. Any advance on B? So B is the correct answer, so it's 1 in 5. So this is according to data from the NSPCC. So during the lockdown, NSPCC saw a 32% increase in calls around domestic abuse. And as Liz mentioned in her kind of opening speech, we were very conscious during lockdown that families were forced to be, within their homes with little contact with the outside world, children having little contact with sort of other adults, people who may be able to safeguard them. So the likelihood of domestic abuse increasing during lockdown was very, very high and has been reflected in terms of referral rates into services. It's worth noting, and another reason why we've got domestic abuse as a priority for the Community Safety Partnership in North West Leicestershire, is that North West Leicestershire has the highest levels of domestic abuse offences per 10,000 population of all of the Leicestershire districts. So, the rates and prevalence that we see in this particular part of the county are significantly higher than elsewhere. Next slide, please. How many times will a victim be physically assaulted before they call the police or seek support? A, 15, B, 20, or C, 35? Seem to have some very knowledgeable people this afternoon.
I was just going to say the same.
So the correct answer is C35, which isn't, is another. I mean, I think all of these statistics are really, really shocking and alarming. But that one is particularly the case, and it's worth noting, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later in the presentation, but during pregnancy and after leaving an abusive relationship is often the most risky times in terms of homicides connected with domestic abuse. Next slide, please. Of the 5 serious case reviews that have been produced and published across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, how many cited domestic abuse as a significant factor? So A3, B4 or C5? Any advance on C?
Oh.
5. Yeah, everybody's saying 5. So the correct answer is B. And I think, you know, this is a really important slide and message, because obviously domestic abuse plays a part in situations where really bad things can happen within families that result in serious case reviews. But I think our work within the Children and Family Wellbeing Service shows that domestic abuse plays a part across all thresholds of work with children and families. You know, we do have very serious cases of domestic abuse where, you know, often families will be under social care, but there are more subtle, shall we say, or less obvious forms of abuse within relationships, within families that we see very, very commonly, which is why sessions like today are really important in terms of raising awareness of the things to look out for and the different forms that domestic abuse can take. Next slide, please. So we moved now to think a little bit more about work within schools. So in 2018-19, how many Operation Encompass calls were made to schools in Leicestershire? A, 1,024, B, 1,897, or C, 2,522. So a couple of votes for B, couple for C. Okay, so the correct answer is C, 2,522. Are people familiar with what Operation Encompass is? Is there anybody that hasn't heard of that term before? I'm assuming that everybody's familiar with what Operation Encompass is. There were some people on the training session last week that hadn't heard of it. So in case people, and for the benefit, in case people aren't sort of wanting to come forward and say that they haven't heard of it, Operation Encompass is a system that ensures that a simple phone call or notification is made to a trained member of school staff before in school following a domestic abuse incident. So our domestic abuse team, who sit at South Wigston Police Station, receive overnight lists from all of the sort of police across Leicestershire of any domestic abuse incidents that have happened overnight. So the team convene very early in the morning each day, and where there have been incidents affecting children who are in school, a call is made by the police, which is to trigger a response within school, so that schools are aware that, you know, that a child may have experienced some trauma and may not, you know, they may be a little bit out of sorts when they arrive in school that day, or if they don't arrive in school that day, it's a trigger to perhaps make contact with the family to find out that all, you know, that the child is okay and see if any support is required. To our minds, Operation Encompass is not just about one person in a school finding out that a domestic abuse incident has happened. It should be about there then being a resulting conversation with form tutors, pastoral members of staff, any person who has a significant relationship with the child, classroom teachers, so that they are all aware to keep an eye on that child, not obviously to go and have a conversation with the child, but to have some awareness. So one thing that we will mention later in the session is that we'd be really interested for you to go back and ask more about how that functions within your schools, because I think often a call is made to you know, the designated safeguarding lead and then not necessarily filtered down across all of the staff team. And certainly that, you know, that was the feedback from last week, because we had, I think, about 40 people in the training last week, and a number of them had not heard of Operation Encompass before, which was quite surprising. Next slide, please, Gillian. So a little bit more context to the data that we've been sharing as part of those questions. So this is data from 2018-19 around the prevalence of domestic abuse, and this data has been fed into and informed the strategic framework and delivery plan for domestic abuse that the County Council kind of own and deliver against. So there were 10,304 domestic abuse incidents and crimes reported to Leicestershire Police in 18-19. 16% of all crime was domestic abuse related, and 42% of all violence against persons crimes were domestic abuse related. So a huge proportion of the overall number of crimes that are reported to Leicestershire Police feature domestic abuse. 786 cases were heard at MARAC. So MARAC is where the most sort of risky cases of domestic abuse are discussed. And in Leicestershire, differently to most other parts of the country, there are daily MARACs where those cases are discussed. And across those 786 cases, there were 1,012 separate child victims identified through that process. Across 18-19, there was just 1,000 single assessments undertaken by Leicestershire County Council. So this is the assessment that's undertaken by Children's Social Care. Of those, 61% identified domestic abuse identified domestic abuse within a parent carer. 7.9% identified child, and 1.4% identified domestic abuse with another person in the household. 91%, so nearly 92% of domestic abuse referrals progressed to single assessment within Leicestershire. So that just provides a bit more context again in terms of the prevalence within crime as a whole, but also in terms of the work that Children's Social Care undertake with children and families. Next slide, please. We've got a little bit more detail now around the Operation Encompass data. So First Response Children's Duty made 2,522 calls to a total of 1,214 schools in 18-19. Those calls related to a total of 2,723 children. At the time of those calls, 21% of those were open to children and family services. 43% were known to the Children and Family Wellbeing Service. 71% were known to social care. So there was 30% of those children had not crossed the threshold or door of children's services, which again highlights the very, very important role that you play when you are seeing children and families day in, day out, because there will be inevitably cases of domestic abuse where statutory or even Children and Families Wellbeing Service are not aware. And so the children within those families need any adults that they're coming into contact with to have the sort of the knowledge and foresight to keep an eye on them and look for the warning signs that might be present that indicate that domestic abuse is happening within their home. We've included the link to Operation Encompass at the end of this slide. The website offers free online training and more information, so it might be that you want to have a look at that as kind of homework from this session. So moving on, how many types of domestic abuse are there and what are they?
Want to write your answers in the message bar again or shout them out?
Let's have some shouts. Let's have some voices. How many types of domestic abuse are there and what are they? So feel free to shout out one if you don't know all of them.
Physical violence.
Physical violence, thank you.
Psychological.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you.
Coercive control.
Brilliant, thank you.
Emotional.
Is that emotional, did somebody just say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to how many types? No.
No. Okay.
8.
So, sorry, did somebody just say something?
I was guessing 8.
Okay, good guess.
No,
good
we
guess.
like a guess. Thank you.
We like, yeah, absolutely. We like a guess. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, please, Gillian. Okay, so there are coming. There we go. So there are 6 different types of domestic abuse. Oh, we've gone a slide too far.
And it's 7, Ben, not 6.
Oh, sorry, 7. Oh, yeah, because we popped in this stalking and harassment, didn't we? Sorry. So we've got physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, stalking and harassment, and coercive control. We are going to send out some examples of what each one of these looks like for you at the end. But one of the questions that we asked last week, which was quite interesting, was what are you seeing a lot at school, and does everybody know what they all mean and what they could look like? I know I just said we were going to send them out, but was anybody really struggling with any of those?
Were any of those not known to people, firstly? Would anyone like to share from their experience what types of domestic abuse you have seen within your cohort of students? Is someone saying they didn't know about financial? Stalking and harassment, hadn't realised it was one yet.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. I think financial abuse is, I mean, it can be standalone, but it's often also a factor of a number of other forms of domestic abuse. And it's something to be aware of, especially, you know, again, referring back to the pandemic and the sort of current situation that we find ourselves in, because for many families, the lockdown and the resulting restrictions have led to people being furloughed, led to people losing their jobs. So finances for a lot of families are a lot more under pressure than they were previously. And so, you know, that could be a time that potential abusers could really kind of hone in and control those finances. And there are signs that you could look out for in terms of engagement within school.
We've got a question in the chat box. Is neglect not another type?
Are you answering that, Kate?
You can.
Okay. So no, neglect's not one of those types of domestic abuse, because the neglect would be related to an actual child in terms of neglect of a child. So that would fall under, you know, well, neglect.
It's a safeguarding issue, but it's not a type of domestic abuse.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I know it's difficult to sort of understand that sometimes, but you have to remember that, you know, where we've got children, I know we sort of spoke about 16-year-olds, but that's a 16-year-old in their own right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And also, you know, as Ben said earlier, domestic abuse is about power and control. Neglect might be linked to power and control, or there might be features of power and control, but it's not intrinsic. There's a lot more to neglect than simply power and control. So neglect is a standalone safeguarding issue, but it's not a form of domestic abuse.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these different types of domestic abuse would impact on somebody and how they look after themselves, how they care for themselves, absolutely. So in terms of like that kind of neglect, it would definitely be there. Like Katie said, it would be a feature of what was going on with all the different types of abuse that they were being subjected to at the time.
Yeah. So next slide, please.
Okay, so what signs might there be that domestic abuse is happening in the home of a child you are teaching? want to shout out again? Any thoughts? What kinds of things do you think that you might be seeing in school? Change in personality,
Changing behaviour.
change in behaviour. Sorry, Ellen, what did you say?
I said the same, changing behaviour.
Oh, okay.
And when you say a change in behaviour, how might that manifest?
So more anxious than normal, or normal things that probably wouldn't bother them might be bothering them.
So less resilient.
Yeah, much less resilience I've seen.
Somebody, sorry. And somebody's just put on another change would be like anger as well, with being withdrawn, change in eating habits. Yeah.
More or less, yeah. Just knowing the young person and seeing a difference in them. That's, yeah, I like that answer. Being withdrawn, out of character aggression.
Yeah.
Maybe choosing not to eat their lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah, things like that.
Maybe not wanting to get changed for PE in case they've got bruises.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
good one.
Yeah.
Maybe just talking to you and telling you stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to just show you some signs and indicators of domestic abuse and things that you might see at school, or things that you could look out for. So aggression or bullying, antisocial behaviour. So if they started vandalising things or property, either at school or home, or if they're coming in with injuries to themselves, anxiety, depression or suicidal thoughts, bedwetting, nightmares or insomnia, constant or regular sickness, e.g. colds, headaches, mouth ulcers, drug or alcohol use, so taking those risky behaviours, staying out till late, not coming home on time,
Not wanting
boundaries.
to go home, someone had put in the message bar.
Yeah, absolutely. Lack of trust in adults and tantrums.
Other signs and indicators, so eating disorders, trouble learning in school or at home, withdrawal, over-compliance, overachievers, attention seeking, changes in behaviour, lack of care or self-care, and nervous of changing for PE, which somebody already mentioned. And I think some of those seem more obvious than others. And I think, that's where we start to think about the breadth and the different types of domestic abuse, because when people think about just physical abuse, you wouldn't necessarily link all of those behaviours. You might do, but you wouldn't necessarily link all of those signs and indicators to physical abuse alone. And the issue of financial abuse, which somebody had said they weren't aware that was one. Someone, not having food to bring in or not having money for lunch, those are all sort of small, subtle things that some people could miss, but it's about, being really aware and really curious in terms of the children that you teach and looking out for those signs and indicators.
Yeah, and presentations are really good. So things, when I'm talking about presentation, I don't just mean what their behaviour looks like, but also what they're wearing as well. So again, going back to what Katie said about the financial control, it may be that the victim mum, for example, isn't allowed to have money to go and buy the children new clothes, so therefore they're coming to school in clothes that are too small for them. It could be that they're dirty, it could be because they're ripped. All of those things. Yeah.
We had wanted to share with you a video clip at this point in the presentation, but for some reason, when we tried this last week, it didn't work, so we decided to take it out for this week, but we will circulate it. The link will be in the presentation that we'll send out to you. But the video clip was a brief interview, or is a brief interview, with Luke and Ryan Hart, who are the sons of the Hart family who were involved in a very significant and tragic domestic abuse case back in 2016. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that, because for me, this really challenges some of our assumptions about what domestic abuse looks like. And really highlights the need for us all to be professionally curious when we're dealing with children and families. So on July the 19th, 2016, a man drove to the leisure centre in Spalding with ammunition and a gun and waited. When his wife, who'd recently let him, came out of the leisure centre a while later, her and her daughter had been in for their swim, which they did very regularly. He shot his wife, reloaded the gun, shot his daughter, reloaded the gun and shot himself. The two sons were older and they had both left home, and they heard about the incident that had occurred in Spalding, where they were from. I think they literally heard about it initially through the sort of, through the media, social media. And once they couldn't get hold of their mum or their sister, I think they knew or suspected very quickly that it could be their family that were involved in this hideous turn of events. And the two sins talked about the years of bullying and oppression that they experienced, the whole family experienced at the hands of their father. He controlled all aspects of their lives, including their finances and all of their movement. So each family member was very repressed, and they lived by very kind of controlled restrictions within the home. But according to the rest of the world, everything seemed absolutely fine. There was nothing that anybody had noticed that would draw attention to this family. And very importantly, no one in the family thought at the time that they were victims of domestic abuse. Their view was that domestic abuse equaled physical violence. So despite their father being a bully and being psychologically controlling and dominating their lives, they hadn't recognised that that was domestic abuse. And what in fact they had been living with was extreme coercive control, which of course is now recognised as a form of domestic abuse. And in the clip that we will send out and that you can watch, Luke and Ryan talk about the atypical nature of their family in terms of, of being subject of domestic abuse. In school, they were high achievers, they were very compliant, and that came down to partly the oppression that they were experiencing at home. And so their kind of plea to professionals working with children and families is to have that professional curiosity. Nick's comment about knowing a young person and looking for differences in them, that will depend on individuals, but it's about us being really proactive and purposeful in our interactions with children and families on a daily basis to sort of look out for some of those subtleties that might not necessarily immediately come to the fore as being a kind of glaring red light for domestic abuse. So I think that is a really interesting case. So please do have a look at the YouTube video that we send out, and there's the series case review is available to download on the internet, and it is definitely worth a read because coercive control is so prevalent in so many relationships. People often describe it as walking on eggshells, but it can have such a paramount impact on children living within households where it's a factor. So it's worth doing a little bit of reading and a bit more research after today's session. So next slide, please, Gillian.
Katie, can I just mention something
Yeah.
just quickly on the signs and indicators? One of the things that we perhaps haven't got on there is just being aware that children can be really secretive about talking about home life, because they just want to make sure that their family's safe. So they won't necessarily come out, obviously, and just say, oh, this is happening at home. They are very, very secretive and won't share hardly any information about what's happening in the home, won't talk about things that they've done at the weekend, or they might make up stories about what they've done, so that they're given the impression that everything's fine at home because they're so frightened about what might happen because they may have been threatened by the perpetrator that they have to be quiet about everything.
And sometimes it can be the most throwaway comment. I remember doing some training a couple of years ago, and a woman mentioned a conversation that she had had with, I think it was a contact through his school and a conversation that had been had with a little boy. I think he was only about 6 or 7. And he'd basically been talking about how important breakfast was to him, and how, you know, he you know, it was just, he was pinning such a lot of kind of emphasis on breakfast. And when they kind of dug a little bit deeper, the emphasis on breakfast he sort of disclosed was because having breakfast meant that he knew mummy was still alive. And he was, you know, his mum was experienced such horrendous batterings at night, and he was hearing that. So his, you know, his kind of appreciation that she was there was the fact that he was getting breakfast in the morning. So sometimes the most kind of, you know, seemingly inane or insignificant comments can actually be, you know, hiding something really, really significant.
Yeah, and reactions to situations as well. So I'll just give a really quick brief one. So you know, a tactic of a perpetrator could be in the family home that, you know, who could be come home from work, sit down at the table, and he could shake his keys. The children know to leave the room because the keys have been shaken, and that's, you know, that's one of the stories that I've heard in the past from children. So they knew then that they have to leave the room because they know something bad's going to happen. So it's just worth bearing in mind that sometimes when children flinch at things, certain things that are a little bit odd, just to take notice. And like Katie was saying earlier, that professional curiosity as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So we thought this slide was really useful to share. It's from Women's Aid and basically explores how domestic abuse can impact on children, and that kind of cumulative impact. So obviously not all abuse is seen, but children can, whether they witness it, whether they feel that fear, or experience verbal, emotional abuse, or whether they actually experience abuse themselves, that cumulative effect can lead to attachment issues, developmental delays, and long-term psychiatric problems, which is obviously why we're really keen that you know, we can kind of recognise the signs and intervene to, you know, stop children from ultimately experiencing abusive environments at home. So what would you do if you were worried about a child? Are you clear on your own safeguarding procedures in school?
Yeah.
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 That's good. So what would you do if you were worried? I don't know who said yes.
Go to the DSL.
Yeah, go to the DSL. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not about approaching the child or trying to talk to the parents. It's about having a conversation with your DSL in terms of what happens next. So someone's put a report on CP-OMS and follow up. I don't know what CP-OMS is. Is that an internal?
It's a recording system for incidents.
Right, within school.
Yeah, we use that as well. I go to the DSL first, and then it'll go on CPOMS.
Yeah.
And I think the CPOMS is really good because what it does, if you're recording everything that you were concerned about, it actually builds up a chronology and a bit of a story about a journey of what that child's going through as well. We get to see a lot of CPOM stuff where we're concerned about children, and it really helps to build a picture of what life looks like for them and where incidents have happened. And yeah, exactly, builds up a pattern.
So you've already got notes formulated in a way that will help if you're collating those then in terms of evidence. That's really useful. So final slide, please, Gillian.
Yeah, and that's really key actually. Also, it transfers to the next school, and they absolutely need to be aware when they move up to the next school.
Yeah, that transfer of information is absolutely critical, isn't it? So we thought it was useful to flag up local support for children and families. There's also a couple of national contacts on here as well. So as you've already said, your first port of call within school would be your DSL, but also you can make a referral to Children and Family Services through the multi-agency referral form, the MARF, which is on the Leicestershire County Council website. UAVA, United Against Violence and Abuse, are the consortia of domestic abuse support services who work on behalf of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So they run support services for victims, they run a professionals advice line. So they are the sort of go-to specialists for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. They also run quite a lot of training around domestic abuse. Within Leicestershire County Council, obviously within Children's Services, there's a statutory role that we have. But also within Children and Family Wellbeing Service, as well as case holding families. As Ben mentioned earlier on in the session, we run the Freedom Programme, which is for survivors of domestic abuse, and the Feeling Safe Programme, which is for children who over 8 years old who've experienced domestic abuse. So if you wanted to make a referral for either of those groups, you would do that on the multi-agency referral form. And if it's specifically for that group and you know that it's for that group, it's really helpful to make that obvious on the MARF. And then when we're doing the allocation of cases, it makes life a lot easier. NACOA is a national organisation supporting children of alcoholic parents. We've also put COOTH online counselling service on here. So Leicestershire County Council commissioned COOTH to provide online counselling for young people, and there's a sort of a range of different support available through COOTH. So there's online one-to-one counselling, as well as kind of support groups and activities and different forums that young people can access. So that is well worth recommending to young people. There's the National Centre for Domestic Abuse and Violence. There's obviously Leicestershire Police. There's the NSPCC and Childline. So a number of different services and agencies that you can go to, many of which I'm sure you have heard of before. But hopefully it's useful for you to know the local services that are available, as well as some of the national ones. Final slide, please, Gillian. That's it in terms of our sort of planned delivery. Thank you for coming and for your participation. Has anybody got any questions before we kind of round up?
Don't think so. Thank you very much.
Any questions or comments? It would be really great to capture any kind of feedback, comments that you've got in the chat. And we'd like to ask a couple of things of you, if that's okay. Firstly, to promote the training within your staff teams. As Liz said, the session's been recorded, so we can make that available for staff meetings if that is something that would be useful. As I said earlier, it would be good if any of you were unsure about your Operation Encompass processes within school. I'd urge you to go away and find that out. And I think there's going to be an evaluation form emailed out, Liz, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We'll be sending out some feedback forms now we've finished the 2 of the planned sessions. So yeah, we'll be getting those out.
Brilliant. So I hope that's been useful for people. I hope that's kind of what you expected when you signed up for the session.
So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Katie and Benita for delivering the session today. And as Katie said, we hope you've enjoyed it and you found it interesting and that you're taking something away from it today. We will be sending out the feedback forms, but obviously if you want to pop any feedback in the chat box now before you leave, that would be great also. And the other thing that I'd like to say that is in terms of the format of today's session, sort of these short bite-sized sessions around domestic abuse. Obviously today's been an introduction, but if there are other topics that you'd like to see covered in a similar way, way, it'd be great if you could let us know, and then we can look at, as a group, as the Domestic Abuse Action Group, we can look at what other sessions potentially we could look at putting on for you in a similar format. So, you know, when you do provide that feedback, if there is anything else that you'd like to see or anything that you'd like to see covered in any more detail, then let us know, and then we can have a look at what we're able to provide in the future. But if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, for giving up your time and for participating in the session, and have a lovely evening.
We will stay on if anybody wants to stay and kind of ask anything, you know, more privately, but our contact details are also there if you want to make contact at a later date.